The scent of freshly cut grass and chlorine from the neighbor's pool was the official perfume of summer in Maple Creek, Ohio. For Ethan Hayes, it was the smell of perfection. He leaned against the doorframe of his back porch, a cold beer sweating in his hand, and watched his world unfold in a symphony of domestic bliss. His wife Clara was a vision in a simple white sundress, her honey blonde hair tied up in a messy bun that somehow looked effortlessly chic. She was tending to her prized rose bushes, humming a soft, tuneless melody that was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Their 6-year-old daughter, Lily, a miniature version of her mother with Ethan's dark, serious eyes, was chasing after the sprinkler's spray, her squeals of laughter like wind chimes in the gentle afternoon breeze. And then there was the newest member of the family, the agent of chaos and unconditional love. Buddy, a golden retriever puppy whose paws were still comically too big for his body. Ethan had brought him home 3 weeks ago, a surprise for Lily's birthday, and the dog had seamlessly woven himself into the fabric of their lives. "Ethan, honey, can you grab the little trowel from the shed?" Clara called out, wiping a delicate sheen of sweat from her brow with the back of a gloved hand. "This stubborn weed is putting up a fight." "On it," he said, taking a final swig of his beer. The life he had was the one they put in brochures for the American dream. He'd met Clara in college, a bright, ambitious art history major who seemed to glide through life with a quiet confidence that he, a perpetually flustered architecture student, found irresistible. They'd married a year after graduation, bought this house with its big backyard, and brought Lily into the world. Every day felt like a gift he hadn't quite earned. He found the trowel and was heading back when he saw Buddy digging with a manic intensity near the old oak tree at the far end of the yard. Dirt flew in frantic arcs, dusting the puppy's golden fur. "Buddy, no, bad dog," Ethan called, his voice more amused than angry. "Clara's going to have your hide if you dig up her azaleas." The dog paused, looked back at Ethan with a lolling tongue and dirt on his nose, then let out a sharp yip and resumed his excavation with renewed vigor. Lily, abandoning the sprinkler, ran over to help, clapping her hands and shouting, "Dig, Buddy, dig! Find the treasure!" Ethan chuckled and walked over, ready to gently pull the dog away. "All right, Captain Goldpaws, that's enough. Let's not—" His voice trailed off. Buddy had unearthed something. It wasn't a rock or a root. It was long, pale, and unnervingly symmetrical. A stick, maybe? But as the puppy nudged it with his nose, rolling it over, Ethan saw the distinct knobbed end of it. A joint, a knuckle, a cold dread, completely alien to this sun-drenched afternoon, washed over him. "Lily, sweetie," he said, his voice tight. "Why don't you go inside and get Buddy a bowl of water? He looks thirsty." "But the treasure, Daddy." "Go on, sweetie. I'll check for the treasure. Go help Mommy," he said, nudging her gently toward the house where Clara was now watching, a curious frown on her face. Once Lily was out of earshot, Ethan knelt down. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He used the trowel he was still holding to carefully scrape away more of the loose soil. The initial object was definitely a bone, a long one, a femur, his mind supplied from some long-forgotten biology class. And it was attached to another, and another, a hip bone, ribs, a partial spine curled in the fetal position. The world tilted on its axis. The smell of cut grass was suddenly cloying, nauseating. This wasn't a lost pet, this was human, buried in his yard, buried in the perfect, safe sanctuary he had built for his family. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his mouth to stifle a gasp. Clara was walking toward him now, her smile from moments ago replaced with a look of concern. "Ethan, what is it? You're as white as a ghost." He couldn't form words. He just pointed a trembling finger at the shallow, obscene pit Buddy had dug. Clara followed his gaze. Her hands flew to her mouth, a sharp, strangled cry escaping her lips. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the perfect green lawn, the sound of her sob cutting through the idyllic summer air like a siren. Ethan's mind was a frantic scramble of thoughts, but one pushed its way to the forefront with terrifying clarity. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling with the screen. He dialed 3 numbers that had, until this moment, been nothing more than an abstraction. 911, what is your emergency? Ethan took a shaky breath, his eyes fixed on the half-unearthed skeleton in his backyard and his weeping wife. My name is Ethan Hayes, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. My dog found something in our yard. I think it's a body. The flashing lights of the police cruisers painted the serene suburban street in strobing blues and reds, a garish violation of the evening quiet. The yellow tape was a scar across the landscape of Ethan's life, cordoning off his home, his yard, his shattered sense of security. Neighbors gathered on their lawns, whispering, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and fear. The Maple Creek Police Department had set up a tent over the excavation site, floodlights bleaching the color from the lawn. Ethan sat on his living room sofa, a scratchy wool blanket draped over his shoulders by a kind-faced officer. Though he wasn't cold, he felt hollowed out, a spectator in his own home. Clara was upstairs with Lily, who had been blissfully unaware of the horror unfolding in her playground. A female officer was with them, a gentle presence meant to soothe, but Ethan knew there was no real comfort to be had. Two detectives had taken over his kitchen. The older one, a man named Miller with a weary face and a rumpled suit, nursed a cup of coffee at the table. His partner, a younger, sharper woman named Detective Chen, was the one asking the questions. Mr. Hayes, you've lived here for how long? She asked, her pen poised over a small notebook. 7 years, Ethan said, his voice flat. We bought it right after it was built. We're the only owners. And the land before that? I don't know. It was just an empty lot for as long as I can remember. Part of an old farm that was parceled off for development. Miller spoke up from the table, his voice a low gravel. So whoever is out there was likely put in the ground before this house even existed. It was a small comfort, but it did little to ease the knot in Ethan's stomach. The idea that he, Clara, and Lily had been living their lives, having barbecues, playing catch, just feet above a human grave, was grotesque. We'll need to speak with your wife as soon as she's able, Chen said gently. She's a wreck, Ethan stammered. She's barely coherent. As if on cue, Clara appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her face pale and streaked with tears. She had changed out of her sundress and into a gray sweatshirt and sweatpants, wrapping her arms around herself as if she were freezing. She looked small and fragile, and a protective instinct surged through Ethan. He stood and went to her, guiding her to the sofa. Mrs. Hayes, Detective Miller said, his tone softening slightly. I'm Detective Miller. This is Detective Chen. We know this is incredibly difficult, but we need to ask you a few questions. Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. Anything, she whispered. Did you know of anyone who might have had a reason to use that land for something like this? Chen asked. Clara shook her head slowly. No, we didn't know anything about it before the development. The police worked through the night. Ethan and Clara sat in a state of suspended animation. The silence in the house punctuated by the crackle of police radios and the muted sounds of the forensic team outside. Around 3 a.m., Detective Miller came back inside, his face grim. We have a preliminary identification, he said, his eyes on Clara. The county medical examiner was able to get a quick match on dental records from the National Database for Missing Persons. The remains belonged to a woman named Ilara Vance. Ethan stared at him, the name meaning nothing, but beside him, Clara went rigid. She let out a sound, a choked, guttural sob of disbelief. Mrs. Hayes, Miller asked, his gaze sharpening. Does that name mean something to you? Clara looked up, her blue eyes wide with a horror that seemed to transcend the initial shock. Tears streamed down her face. Vance, she whispered, her voice cracking. That was my maiden name. Ilara was my sister, my twin sister. The room fell silent. Ethan's mind reeled. He knew, of course, that Clara had a twin. She rarely spoke of her. The story was brief and tragic. Ilara had been the wild one, the rebel. She'd fallen in with a bad crowd after high school, struggled with addiction, and had simply vanished about 10 years ago. A few years before Ethan and Clara had even met. They'd all assumed she'd just run off to start a new life, cutting all ties. Your sister? Detective Chen asked, her professional calm faltering for a second. You're certain? Yes, Clara sobbed, burying her face in her hands. Oh God, Ilara, all this time, I thought she was just gone. But she was here, how? Miller and Chen exchanged a look. The comfortable theory that the body predated the house was now shattered. The case had just become infinitely more complex and infinitely more personal. Mrs. Hayes, Miller said, his voice carefully neutral. When was the last time you saw your sister? 10 years ago, Clara said through her tears. We had a fight, a stupid, awful fight. She said she was leaving, that she hated this town, hated our parents, hated me. She packed a bag and walked out. We filed a missing persons report, but nothing ever came of it. We just learned to live with it. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. He could feel her whole body trembling. He felt a surge of guilt. He had never pushed her to talk about Ilara, sensing it was a deep well of pain for her. He'd just accepted her story. Now, that story had a monstrous, unthinkable ending. Her troubled, long-lost sister, the one who had disappeared a decade ago, had been lying in a shallow grave in their backyard the entire time. The random horror had just become a family tragedy. But a question, cold and sharp, cut through Ethan's shock and grief. How in God's name did Ilara Vance's body end up buried in a yard, on a property that wouldn't even exist for another 3 years? The days that followed were a blur of muted colors and hushed tones. The media descended like vultures, their news vans parked down the street, long-lensed cameras trained on their house. The story was irresistible. A perfect suburban family, a golden retriever, and a dark secret unearthed in the backyard. Twin skeleton found in sister's yard. The headlines were as lurid as they were painful. Clara retreated into herself. She moved through the house like a ghost, her eyes vacant and red-rimmed. She barely ate. She spent hours in Lily's room, holding her daughter as if she were a life raft in a storm of grief. Ethan's heart ached for her. To lose a sister was one thing. To find her like this, after a decade of agonizing uncertainty, was a unique and cruel form of torture. He tried to be her rock, fielding calls from concerned family members, dealing with the police, and shielding her from the worst of the media intrusion. Detectives Miller and Chen became frequent, unwelcome visitors. They re-interviewed Clara, gently but persistently probing the details of her last encounter with Ilara. Her story remained consistent. A bitter argument, harsh words exchanged, a slammed door, and then silence. For 10 years. The problem we're having, Mr. Hayes, Detective Miller explained to Ethan one afternoon, standing awkwardly in their pristine kitchen, is the timeline. The ME places the time of death roughly 10 years ago, consistent with when your wife says her sister disappeared. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the back of the head. This was a homicide. Someone killed Ilara Vance and buried her on this empty plot of land. So you're looking for who she was with? The bad crowd Clara mentioned? Ethan asked, desperate for a tangible enemy, a faceless monster to blame. We are, Miller said, his eyes unreadable. But we also have to account for the location. It's a hell of a coincidence, you have to admit. Of all the places in Ohio to bury a body, the killer chose the one exact spot where her twin sister would end up living years later. The implication hung in the air, ugly and unspoken. Ethan felt a flash of anger. Are you suggesting Clara had something to do with this? That's insane. Look at her, she's destroyed. She loved her sister, even if they had a difficult relationship. Everyone is a person of interest until they're not, Miller said, his tone placating. It's just procedure. We're exploring every angle. But the seed of doubt, however small and irrational, had been planted. Not a doubt in Clara's innocence. That was unthinkable, but a doubt in the neatness of reality itself. His perfect life had been built on a lie, even if it wasn't his lie. The ground beneath his feet was literally and figuratively unstable. Weeks turned into a month. The police investigation seemed to stall. Ilara's old contacts were dead ends. Drifters and addicts who had either disappeared themselves or had no memory of her. The case grew cold. Another tragic local mystery destined to be forgotten by everyone except the family it had broken. Life began to creep back toward a fragile semblance of normalcy. Lily returned to school. Ethan went back to his architectural firm, the sympathetic glances from his coworkers a constant reminder of the bizarre tragedy. Clara slowly began to emerge from her cocoon of grief. She started cooking again, tending to her garden, though she avoided the far corner by the old oak tree, which now had a large, ugly patch of new sod. But something had changed. Something inside Clara. Or maybe, Ethan thought with a shudder, something inside his perception of her. He started noticing little things, tiny inconsistencies, that pricked at the edges of his consciousness. One night, he cooked her favorite meal, a shrimp scampi he had perfected over years of trial and error. She had always loved it, always raved about his secret ingredient, an extra clove of garlic. But when he set the plate in front of her, she pushed the shrimp around with her fork, a look of mild distaste on her face. "Everything okay, honey?" he asked. "It's fine," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm just not that hungry, I guess." She ate the pasta but left every single shrimp. When he was cleaning up, he remembered something from a decade ago, a memory from one of their first dates. She had told him about a silly childhood incident, getting sick from bad shellfish and developing a lifelong aversion to it. They had laughed about how she'd bravely conquered it for his scampi. But her reaction tonight wasn't one of a conquered aversion. It was one of genuine dislike, as if she'd never liked it at all. He dismissed it. Stress. Grief did strange things to people's appetites. A week later, they were watching an old movie, a black and white classic she had introduced him to in college. "I've always loved this scene," she murmured, curling up against him as the main characters danced on a moonlit terrace. "The way he looks at her, it reminds me of our first dance at the wedding." Ethan froze. Their first dance had been to a modern indie folk song he'd chosen. They'd argued playfully about it for weeks because she had wanted a classic jazz standard. It was a fond, specific memory for him. How could she misremember that? "I thought you wanted to dance to Etta James," he said lightly, trying to sound casual. She looked at him, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "Oh, right, of course, silly me. I guess my brain is still scrambled." She laughed it off, but the sound was brittle. He let it go again. His mind was playing tricks on him, connecting dots that weren't there. He was traumatized, and he was projecting his anxiety onto her. It was the only logical explanation. The breaking point came one Saturday morning. He was cleaning out the attic, a task he'd been putting off for years. In a dusty corner, he found a box labeled Clara College. It was filled with old textbooks, photo albums, and letters. He sat on the floor and opened an album. There were pictures of Clara and her friends, their faces young and full of promise. And there were several pictures of Clara and Alara. They were identical, just as she'd said. The same hair, the same smile, the same eyes. But the more he looked, the more he saw subtle differences. Clara's smile in the photos was calmer, more reserved. Alara's was wider, a little wilder. In one photo, the twins were at the beach, arms slung around each other. He zoomed in on the photo with his phone. On Alara's right wrist, there was a small, distinctive mole, just below the thumb. He had never seen a mole like that on Clara's wrist. He then noticed something else, a candid shot of Clara writing in a notebook. She was holding the pen in her left hand. Ethan's blood ran cold. His Clara, the woman he had lived with and loved for nearly a decade, was right-handed. He had watched her sign documents, write grocery lists, paint with Lily, always with her right hand. He scrambled through the box, his hand shaking. He found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were from Alara, sent to Clara during her first year of college. The handwriting was a loopy, slightly messy script. He pulled out a recent birthday card Clara had given him from his bedside table and compared the writing. It was close, very close, but it wasn't the same. The way she wrote her T's was different. The slant was less pronounced. A terrifying, impossible idea began to form in his mind, a piece of shrapnel working its way to the surface. He thought of the shrimp, the wedding song, the left-handed writing, the mole. These weren't the quirks of a grieving woman. They were the mistakes of an imposter. He stumbled down the attic stairs, his heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. Clara was in the kitchen, humming that same soft, tuneless melody as she arranged flowers in a vase. She looked up and smiled at him, the same beautiful smile he had fallen in love with all those years ago. But for the first time, when he looked at his wife, he didn't see Clara. He saw a stranger, and he was utterly, profoundly terrified. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a prison. Every interaction with the woman he called his wife was now freighted with a terrifying new weight. Ethan found himself watching her constantly, scrutinizing every word, every gesture, searching for the cracks in a facade he was now convinced was there. He became an actor himself, playing the part of the supportive husband, while a silent scream echoed in the chambers of his mind. He'd lie next to her in bed, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, and wonder who she was. Was she a monster? A victim? Was he losing his mind? He'd look at Lily, sleeping soundly in her room, and a wave of nausea would hit him. His daughter, his beautiful, innocent daughter, was being raised by a woman who might be a complete stranger. And worse, a killer. He had to know for sure. He couldn't go to the police, not yet. What would he say? My wife doesn't like shrimp anymore, and she forgot our wedding song? They would think he was a grieving husband cracking under the pressure. Miller already had his suspicions, but Ethan needed something concrete, something undeniable. His quest for the truth began in their hometown of Northwood. A 2-hour drive away, he told Clara he needed to visit an old college friend for the weekend, a lie that felt like ash in his mouth. Northwood was a place frozen in time. He went to the local library and spent hours poring over old high school yearbooks. There they were, on page 87 of the senior year edition, Clara and Elara Vance. Side by side, their identical smiles beamed out at him from the glossy page. The captions read, Clara Vance, valedictorian, art club president, headed to Ohio State, and Elara Vance, drama club, detention regular, headed for trouble. Even then, the town had cast them in their roles, the good twin and the bad twin. He tracked down their old high school art teacher, a woman named Mrs. Gable, now retired and living in a small house filled with pottery and cats. Clara and Elara, she said, her eyes misting with memory as she poured him a cup of tea. Like night and day, those two, even if you couldn't tell them apart at first glance. Clara was my star pupil, so focused, so meticulous. A true talent. She was right-handed, but she had this incredible ambidexterity with a paintbrush. A rare gift. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. And Elara? Mrs. Gable sighed. Oh, that poor girl, full of fire and passion, but no direction. She wanted to be an actress. She was a brilliant mimic. She could copy anyone's voice, their mannerisms. It was uncanny, but she was troubled. So much jealousy toward Clara. It ate her up inside. I always worried that girl's fire would consume her. A brilliant mimic. The words chilled him to the bone. His next stop was more difficult. He found the address of a woman who had been Clara's best friend in high school. A woman named Sarah. He found her working at a local salon. Ethan, Clara's husband? She said, surprised, scissors in hand. Is everything okay? I saw the news. It's just awful. How is she holding up? She's struggling, Ethan said, the understatement of the century. Listen, Sarah, this is going to sound strange, but I need to ask you something about her and Elara. Something specific. He asked her about the shrimp allergy. Sarah's eyes widened. Oh my God, the seafood festival, she laughed. Yes, 8th grade. Clara ate a bad oyster and was sick for 3 days. She swore off all seafood for life. Wouldn't even walk past the fish counter at the grocery store. It was a running joke for years. Why? No reason, Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. Just remembering old stories. He had it. The allergy, the left-handedness, the mole, the mimicry, the jealousy. It wasn't a tapestry of coincidences. It was a pattern. It was the truth. The drive back to Maple Creek was surreal. The world outside his car, the trees, the sky, the other cars, all seemed fake, like a painted backdrop for the horror movie his life had become. The woman in his house was not Clara. The woman in his house was Elara, which meant the body Buddy had found, the body they had all mourned, the body of the troubled twin, was the real Clara, his Clara. Alara had killed her sister, and for 10 years, she had been living her life. She had married him, she had given birth to his child. He arrived home after dark. The house was quiet, Lily was asleep. He walked into the kitchen and found Alara sitting at the table, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up at him, a soft, welcoming smile on her face. "Hey, honey, you're back early. How is Kevin?" she asked, using the name of his fictional college friend. The sight of her, so calm, so normal, so perfectly inhabiting the role of his wife, made him physically ill. The love he had felt for her for a decade curdled into something cold and terrifying. He didn't answer her question. He walked over to the counter and placed the high school yearbook on it, open to page 87. He then laid down a copy of the photo of the two girls at the beach. He looked at her, his expression a mask of cold fury and unbearable grief. His voice when he finally spoke was low and steady, stripped of all emotion. "Clara was allergic to shellfish," he said. "She was left-handed, and she didn't have a mole on her wrist." He watched her face. For a split second, the mask of Clara flickered. He saw a flash of pure, cold panic in her eyes. The smile faltered, the warmth vanishing as if a switch had been flipped. She knew he knew. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. The silence stretched for an eternity. "Who?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking on the single, devastating word. "Are you?" The woman sitting across from him was no longer Clara. The soft, familiar lines of her face hardened into something sharp and foreign. The panic in her eyes was quickly replaced by a chilling resignation, then a flicker of defiance. The performance was over. The curtain had fallen. "It took you long enough," she said, her voice a low, throaty rasp that was jarringly different from Clara's gentle alto. It was Alara's voice. "I always wondered when, or if, you'd ever figure it out." Ethan felt the floor drop out from beneath him. Hearing her admit it so plainly was like a physical blow. "All this time, my whole life with you, it's all been a lie." "A lie?" she scoffed, a bitter, humorless laugh escaping her lips. "No, it was an upgrade. I was a better Clara than she ever was. I loved you more. I was a better mother to Lily. She was always so hesitant, so lost in her own thoughts. I gave you everything you wanted. I gave you the perfect life." "You murdered her," Ethan choked out, the words tasting like poison. "You killed your own sister. She had everything." Alara's voice rose, cracking with a decade of repressed fury. "She always had everything, right from the start. She was the good one, the smart one, the talented one. I was just the shadow, the cheap copy. Our parents, our teachers, our friends, they all looked at her with admiration and at me with pity or concern. Do you have any idea what that feels like? To be identical on the outside, but to be told your entire life that you are fundamentally lesser?" She stood up and began to pace the kitchen, her movements agitated, feral. It was like watching a completely different person inhabit the body he knew so intimately. That last day, she had just been accepted into a prestigious grad program in Paris, another golden ticket to a golden life. And she was going to go. She was going to leave me behind in Northwood to rot. We argued. She told me I needed to grow up, to stop blaming her for my own failures. She said I would never have what she had because I didn't deserve it. Alara stopped pacing and stared at him, her eyes burning with a dark fire. She turned her back on me. Right there, on that empty patch of land where we used to play as kids. She turned her back and I just saw red. There was a rock on the ground. I picked it up. I just wanted her to shut up, to stop being so perfect. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of rage, not remorse. When it was over, I panicked. But then, a strange calm came over me. She was gone, the world was quiet, and I thought, what if? What if I could just be her? She had her acceptance letter, her savings, a whole life waiting for her. I just had to step into it. I was a brilliant mimic, you know. I practiced her signature, her voice. It was the role of a lifetime. Ethan felt a profound, soul-crushing wave of grief. He wasn't just mourning the woman he thought he'd married. He was mourning the real Clara, his Clara, who had been murdered by her own sister out of sheer, venomous jealousy. He thought of her last moments, the betrayal, the pain. And me, Ethan whispered. Was I just part of the role? Was our marriage, our daughter, was any of it real to you? Alara's expression softened for a moment, a flicker of something that might have been genuine emotion. When I met you, I was still just playing a part, but you were kind. You saw a light in me that no one else ever had. You saw Clara, yes, but you loved what you saw. And I loved you for it. And Lily is mine. She is the only thing in this world that is truly mine. The front door creaked open. Everything all right in here? Detective Miller's voice cut through the tense silence. He stepped into the kitchen, followed by Detective Chen. Miller's eyes darted from Ethan's pale face to Alara's tear-streaked one, to the yearbook on the counter. His hand rested on the butt of his holstered pistol. I called them on my way here, Ethan said, his voice numb. He looked at Alara. I told them I had new information about my wife's sister. The lie was a final, bitter twist of the knife. He was protecting the identity of the woman in the grave, giving the real Clara her name back one last time. Alara stared at Ethan, a complex storm of emotions playing across her face. Betrayal, understanding, even a strange sort of relief. The weight of the decade-long deception seemed to finally crush her. Her shoulders slumped. The fire in her eyes died out, leaving nothing but embers. She didn't run, she didn't fight. She just slowly, deliberately raised her hands. Detective Chen moved forward, handcuffs clicking in the quiet of the kitchen. As she placed the cold metal around Alara's wrists, her eyes met Ethan's. He saw no triumph in them, only a deep, human sorrow. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Lily! She must have woken up. Alara's head snapped up, her face a mask of primal maternal panic. No, please, she begged, looking at Ethan. Don't let her see me like this. Please, Ethan. It was the first time she had sounded truly broken. Ethan nodded stiffly at Miller. The detective understood. He and Chen guided Alara out the back door, into the yard where this whole nightmare began, sparing their daughter the sight of her mother being taken away in handcuffs. Ethan was left alone in the kitchen. The house was silent again, but the silence was different. It was heavy, absolute. The lie that had filled its walls for 10 years was gone, leaving behind a vacuum of truth and pain. He sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the same one where he'd shared 1,000 breakfasts with a woman who never was. He put his head in his hands and finally, for the first time since Buddy started digging, he wept. He wept for the woman he had loved and lost without ever knowing it. He wept for the years stolen from him. And he wept for the little girl sleeping upstairs, whose entire world had just been irrevocably and monstrously broken. The perfect life was not just a lie, it was a ghost story, and he was left to haunt the ruins.